All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'd like to begin by thanking the conference organizers for this opportunity to present. I look forward to any of your questions and comments that I'm sure will help me make this paper stronger. I look forward to Jessica's discussion. And this is joint work with Thomas Bourveau, Juan-Pu Lin, Guoman Shue, and Haoran Zhu. To set the stage here a little bit, relative performance evaluation, or RPE, has become an increasingly popular feature in CEO pay plans over the last couple of decades. It's exploded in popularity from about 20% to now being used in the majority of S&P 500 companies' CEO pay plans. And the way these grants are structured, you can think of it as grading performance on a curve. It's a rank order tournament for the most part. You pick some measure of performance, maybe it's an accounting number, maybe it's stock performance, and then you form a peer group of typically 10 to 20 other economically similar companies. And then again, it's a rank order tournament. How much you receive in compensation is an increasing function of the number of those peers that you outperform. And in theory, there are a ton of great reasons to structure compensation this way. Chief among the benefits is this notion that it provides better risk-sharing performance. If you and several other firms are similarly exposed to some common sources of risk, well, relative performance evaluation of this form will help you filter through those common shocks. However, theory also tells us that there are several potential downsides or unintended consequences of relative performance evaluation. One of the big ones being the possibility that it incentivizes peer-harming tactics, often referred to as sabotage in this literature. The basic idea is the following. If I get paid based on whether or not I outperform you, well, I can try to do things to improve my own performance. This is the hope. But I can also do things that harm your performance. And if I'm already pretty close to optimizing my own performance, well, there are many more options for me to, twist the dials and levers, use new strategies to harm you than there are for me to further improve myself. So what we're looking at in this paper is, as an empirical matter, in corporate America, do firms engage in these types of tactics? And specifically, we're going to look to this through the lens of talent acquisition. So the research question we try to answer is, do RPE-using firms disproportionately poach labor talent away from their RPE peers as a peer-harming tactic? I turn first to an anecdote from sports, which sort of sets the ground rules here for how we think this might play out. So specifically, Bayern Munich in the Bundesliga, for the past couple decades, has been accused of employing exactly this strategy, poaching talent from their competitors, not because those players are going to be a great fit to make their team better, but simply because they want to deplete their rivals of that talent. So we'll hire this player not because we want them, but simply because we want you not to have them. Now, I don't really follow the Bundesliga. I don't know whether or not this is truly going on. So if you are a fan, but this is the allegation that's out there. Now, athletic competitions like this, it's one of the purest examples of relative performance evaluation you can get, right? It doesn't matter how good or bad your team is in an absolute sense. It's how much better or worse are you than the competitors you play against on the field. So what we're interested to know is, does this same type of force hold up in a corporate setting when we introduce those RPE incentives? Now, why look at employee poaching for this? There are a number of reasons, but first and foremost, it's just the sheer importance of human capital to a typical firm's production function. Zingales 2000 says for many firms, it's their single most crucial asset. And so as a corollary, we would expect that the loss of some key labor talent could be incredibly detrimental to a rival's performance, right? We know that poaching is a big deal. Companies are actively engaged in it. They're really worried about being on the receiving end of it. When they are on the receiving end of it, they have to do costly things like increase the compensation that they pay to their employees to retain that talent. And so for these reasons, we think that this could be a useful tactic for firms to use. Add to that, there's a couple of additional benefits. You can do this in a highly targeted, precise way. You pick and choose exactly which companies you want to poach from, and you can target them specifically at fairly low cost to yourself. If we consider an alternative approach, the most studied in this literature in the past is product market aggression. Well, this can work, but it's a fairly blunt instrument. There's a lot of collateral damage. You can't pick and choose specific rivals you're trying to harm. You're harming everybody in the product market, and in most cases, including a lot of blowback to your own performance. So what we've done in this paper is we provide the first broad sample evidence on the link between CEO incentives and intercompany labor force talent flows. We do this by combining data on employee work histories, which we get from Lightcast, with data on CEO incentive plans, which we get from Incentive Labs. So our overall sample is roughly the Russell 1000, along with each of their closest 50 Hoberg and Phillips rivals over an 11-year period, ending in 2019, right before the start of the pandemic. And contained within our sample is about 200,000 instances of these employee poaches. So from an empirical perspective, the two main measures we're looking at here are a measure of poaching, which indicates whether employees departed from some rival to the focal firm in some particular year, and then RPE peer, which indicates whether or not that focal firm uses that rival as an RPE peer in that year. Now, in trying to pull off a study like this, we face a number of pretty significant empirical challenges, right? First and foremost, poaching is not necessarily an act of sabotage, right? The vast majority of poaching that goes on has nothing to do with RPE incentives making a manager think about how they can harm their rival. It's just firms competing for the best labor talent. Oftentimes, the best employee for the job currently works at a different firm. You got to go out there and get them. You do that through poaching. And this is not the kind of behavior we're interested in studying in this paper. But here's the thing. Those types of poaches should happen with or without RPE incentives. If they're just a good hire for your company, you'll do that with RPE incentives, but you would do exactly those same poaches without those incentives. So what we're going to try to do here is identify whether RPE spurs additional poaching above and beyond this baseline rate, right? Ideally, identifying those poaches that occur with the RPE incentives that in a counterfactual world without those incentives would not have occurred. But of course, that's a tall order because of our second challenge, which is, just the sheer amount of endogeneity present in the setting. Focal firms choose whether or not to use RPE in the first place, and conditional on choosing to use it, they get to pick and choose exactly who they want or don't want in their peer group. So if some omitted factor jointly drives both the choice to benchmark against a particular RPE peer, as well as the choice to poach from that peer, say just some economic similarities that you share, well, this would bias and potentially even invalidate our results. So how do we try to get around this? Well, we're going to throw at this just a bunch of different research design choices to try to mitigate these concerns as much as possible. Throughout our analyses, we're going to use very dense fixed effect structures to try to absorb as much of this variation as possible. We'll also do a lot of cross-sectional splits to see if where the effects show up stronger versus weaker aligns with what you would expect under this sabotage story. We'll also provide some event study tests to see around changes in those RPE peer groups, are there sudden changes in the poaching patterns that go on that correspond to those changes in peer group composition? And then lastly, we'll tackle a handful of specific alternatives that you might be concerned about head on. All right, so what do we find in this study? Well, first and foremost, as a headline finding, do firms poach more heavily from their RPE peers than from their other rivals? And the answer to this, as a descriptive matter, is an easy one. It's a definitive yes. It is an enormous effect in the cross-section. That's specifications 1, 2, and 3. I wouldn't read too much into these results, right? The magnitude here is like 2 to 3 times more poaching from these RPE peers. But this is probably swamped by variation in economic similarity, right? In the cross-section, who goes into your peer group? The more similar companies. Those are also the companies that you have more similar labor talent needs with. So that's, probably just heightened competition for labor talent. But where I think things get a little bit more intriguing is in specification 4. Here we introduce firm rival pairwise fixed effects, and we're going to use these throughout the rest of our analysis. So what we're doing with these fixed effects is we're looking within a firm rival pair, follow that pair through time. At some points in time, that focal firm uses the rival as an RPE peer. And then at other points in time, that same firm does not use that same rival as an RPE peer. And we identify that within that pair, there's about a 3.1 percentage point increase in the incidence of poaching when there is an RPE relationship. And that corresponds to about a 17% effect relative to the baseline variation. And if we use a continuous measure for the intensity of poaching based on the number of employees moving back and forth, it's about a 7% increase relative to the base rate of poaching. All right, but the tougher question is, does this association reflect RPE-motivated sabotage, right? And here's where we can't make a 100% for sure definitive claim, but I would argue that we think the evidence strongly suggests yes. Right? This effect is not explained by firm rival factors, as we just saw, and later we'll see firm year and rival year factors cannot explain this either. Our cross-sectional tests line up nicely with the sabotage story. It's a sharp effect, and then again, we'll try to rule out some specific alternatives towards the end. So with respect to the cross-sectional tests, first thing we look at is who is getting poached. Our supposition is that if this is a strategic peer harming tactic, you want to hit these rival companies where it hurts. You want to go after the most costly to replace employees, which we will proxy for based on their level of skill as measured by the degree of education that they've attained, as well as their experience within the company as measured by their tenure. Right? These higher skill, longer tenured employees, these are going to be the ones that are the hardest, most costly to replace. If you're trying to harm those peers through these poaching events, these are the ones you want to go after, and that is exactly what we find. There's no effect of being an RPE peer for low skill, inexperienced employees, but we do find a significant effect for the higher skill, more experienced employees. Second place we look is the dimensions of the RPE contracts themselves. Two angles we're going to look at this from. What is the metric used to evaluate relative performance? And then second, what is the weight? How prominent are these RPE incentives within the overall pay plan? With respect to the metrics, we're going to decompose RPE into stock price-based and non-stock price-based. So non-stock price-based is typically, accounting numbers or other operational measures of performance. And our supposition is that this poaching strategy probably has a much more immediate direct effect on those operational and accounting measures of performance, and probably a more muted, less direct effect on stock price. And you can more easily affect stock prices of other companies just through your disclosure practices. So we would expect a more pronounced result in the case of these non-price-based RPE grants. And this is exactly what we observe. We see significantly heightened poaching for both price-based RPE peers and non-price-based RPE peers, but the magnitude is about 3 times larger in the case of these non-price-based grants. And then secondly, we just look at, how material are these RPE grants? What fraction of the pay plan is devoted to it? When it's a small proportion, we still see heightened poaching relative to if there's no RPE at all. If it's a large proportion, we see twice the rate of poaching. All right, and then our last cross-sectional split is based on performance proximity. Remember, these are rank order tournaments, which means that the benefits you get from sabotaging a peer is not uniform across the peer group. If there's a peer that you are, losing to handily, they're outperforming you by a wide margin. Well, you're going to lose to that peer whether or not you try to sabotage them, most likely. So it doesn't really confer any benefit. You wouldn't be likely to do it. On the flip side, if you are handily outperforming one of your peers, again, there's no benefit. You're going to beat them with or without that act of sabotage. It's really only when you're jockeying for position, you've got kind of neck and neck recent performance. That's when that little act of sabotage here or there could tip the balance and be marginal in those final performance rankings, leading to extra compensation. That's when you would want to do it. And that is where we find this behavior being more pronounced. And then with respect to our event study, we want to see, is this a sharp change around changes in the compensation plan? Right? We can identify when exactly was a particular rival pulled into the RPE peer group in those 3 years before they were in the peer group compared to those 3 years right after they were pulled into the peer group. Is there a sudden increase in poaching by that RPE using focal firm from that specific peer that was recently added? And we find this even within just that very short window of time. And it's, in terms of economic magnitudes, similar to the baseline that we estimate in the overall panel regression. All right, so I hope that I'm persuading you somewhat towards the possibility that this might be RPE-motivated sabotage, but I think there are still a handful of explanations that could be lingering as concerns in your mind that are worth some further attention. So the first one is economic similarity and convergence. Second, maybe we're really picking up something about compensation benchmark peer groups as opposed to the RPE incentives. And then third, could this be some point in time effects, maybe economic performance or something along those lines? So first, turning to economic similarity. This was the biggest concern that my co-authors and I had. Perhaps for many of you in this room, it's still the biggest concern you have. Right, again, the basic idea here is more similar companies are more likely to be useful RPE peers. You're also more likely to have similar talent needs. This could jointly explain poaching and RPE peer group inclusion. Now, this is the reason that we use those pairwise firm rival fixed effects. And those, I think, do a lot of legwork here for us, but they still only hold fixed the average similarity over our sample window. All right, so to the extent that how similar you and some rival are is a time-varying thing that evolves dynamically over time, well, the average level of similarity doesn't perfectly absorb all of that, right? Maybe two firms become more similar. That explains the peer group inclusion. It also explains the increase in poaching. So how do we try to address this? Well, we're going to do a couple things. First, we're going to lean into the fact that the RPE incentives are, for the most part, asymmetric. The focal firm will use the rival as an RPE peer, but that is not true in reverse in 90% of the cases. But for most notions of similarity, economic similarity is a symmetrical construct. How similar firm A is to firm B is the same as how similar firm B is to firm A. If they become more similar to each other, that's a symmetric thing. So if this is just economic similarity, convergence explaining both of these patterns, well, what we would expect then is bidirectional increases in poaching. These firms become more similar, they compete more for labor talent, more employees start flowing in both directions. But this is not what we observe. The focal firm, when they add the rival to their RPE peer group, they start poaching more from that rival. But the same is not true in reverse. The rival that was added to the RPE peer group does not poach any more from the focal firm that added them. And then secondly, we'll just try to tackle economic similarity head on, get some measures of economic similarity, Hoberg and Phillips product similarity scores, return correlations for similar risk exposures. We don't find either of these things are changing right around these treatment event dates when the rival gets added to the peer group. So again, it does not seem like our results are driven just by economic similarity. Next thing we consider is that maybe this is really a compensation benchmark peer effect, not an RPE peer effect, right? So firms can have two different peer groups if they choose to use RPE at all. All of these companies have to have compensation benchmark peer groups. And these peer groups are explicitly chosen based on labor talent considerations. These are the firms we compete with in the market for executive labor talent. Now, that's executive labor talent. We're focused on rank and file labor talent, but you could easily see how these might be correlated throughout the organization. So if what's going on is just they pick and choose who do we compete with for labor talent, and then some firms say, oh, why don't we use them as an RPE peer group as well, which we know some companies will do, then maybe we're sort of capturing this compensation benchmark peer effect and misattributing it to some RPE incentive. So we look at who's in these compensation benchmark groups and see, is that what's explaining these poaching patterns? And the answer is, very clearly here, no. Being a compensation benchmark peer does not seem to have any bearing on how much you get poached from by the focal firm. And if we control for your status as a compensation benchmark peer, it has no effect on what we estimate the effects of being an RPE peer to be. And then lastly, we worry about the possibility that this could be driven by some performance effect, right? We've got literature that says firms will strategically choose peers that they expect to underperform in the future. It's a rent extraction technique. You get to outperform these peers and look good, but it was just an easy target. And similarly, it's just easier to poach employees from a company that's not doing so well. So to try to address this and a host of other related concerns, we'll introduce firm year and rival year fixed effects into the analysis. So these will perfectly subsume any arbitrary time series of point-in-time effects at the firm level or the rival level, right? So this is economic performance, financial solvency, CEO characteristics and personality traits, any weird regulatory things going on in the headquarters state. As long as it's at the firm level or the rival level, and it's a homogeneous effect throughout the firm, We can control for that perfectly with these fixed effects, and we find it has no negative implications for our results. All right, last thing I want to talk about with my remaining few minutes is, does this strategy work? Right, the premise here is that focal firms are poaching talent from their RPE peers to try to hurt those peers' performance outcomes. Now, ideally, what I'd love to be able to show you is here's tightly identified evidence of exactly the causal effect of this poach on this performance outcome, right? That's not something realistically that we'll be able to do. But if we put on a sort of wider angle lens here and think more broadly about the implications, if our story is true, what would it mean for these RPE peers? And I think the big implication is labor talent is going to be a more expensive input in their production process. You're competing more heavily just to retain your own talent. If you're getting poached by more, more of your employees are getting poached because you find yourself in a bunch of other companies' RPE peer groups, it's just going to push up the price for your own labor talent. So we examine, does how many RPE peer groups you show up in? It's not something you chose. Somebody else decided to put you in their peer group. Does being in more of these peer groups make your own labor talent more expensive? Well, we can't make a causal claim, but descriptively, we see an association here. Your salary to sales ratio is higher if you're in more of these peer groups, as is your salary per employee. And both of these effects are strongest when we look specifically at, are you in a peer group by a focal firm that poaches from its peers? So I think I've only got about another minute or two left here. Let me briefly conclude. What we do in this study, we provide initial evidence on the link between CEO incentives and intercompany labor force talent flows, specifically finding that firms poach from their RPE peers at a significantly greater rate than from their other rivals. And this is true even within a firm rival pair. When you add that rival to your RPE peer group, you immediately start poaching more from that rival. We believe that this association is attributable to the strategic peer harming motivation that these RPE incentives confer to executives. And we think a major implication of this is that it suggests that the design of a CEO incentive plan can have some pretty significant effects on a firm's labor market practices, right? It could influence equilibrium wages for various job roles. It could potentially even influence match efficiency between employers and their employees. If you're poaching employees who were a better fit for their previous employer because you're trying to hurt them, this would not be great for match efficiency. Now, our paper provides only very limited preliminary evidence on this last point, but we think that future work we hope can build on what we've done to give us a bigger, more full picture of what this looks like for the labor market. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. I look forward to any questions or comments you all may have for me that are going to help us make this a better paper. And Jessica, I look forward to your discussion. Thanks again.